In this video, I'm going to talk about Freud and his practices. Since in the last video you asked me many questions about psychoanalysis, Freud and his ideas. I'm sure many of you know Freud wasn't a scientist. He didn't do any scientific research, but he did have a lot of research with his clients, which was incredibly helpful in order to relieve some stress and some anxiety from them. He was pretty interesting and effective guy, and he became very famous for his ideas and his practices that we call psychoanalysis or psychodynamics. One of the very basic idea of Freud non-scientific research is that you have these early childhood experiences which shape you as a person. They actually shape the development of human in a form of the three parts of your psyche: id, ego, and superego. The id is the part that Freud believed people are born with. It's the most primitive and unconscious part of your personality. It motivates you. It's actually part of yourself that just wants things and craves things. I'll give you an example. When you're looking at those chocolates or pizzas or whatever you can think of now, so I want you to imagine. Imagine when you're looking at them cross room, you might know you shouldn't eat them and you're not even that hungry, but you just want them, you crave them. And that's your id. To clarify it more, I have a very good example of pure id, which is newborn babies. Newborn babies, they don't care about restraining themselves. They don't care about what time of day it is. If they want something, they're going to let you know, even if it's 3 a.m. in the morning. And that's what the id is all about. It's very instinctive. But as a child enters the world with just pure id, they start to interact with the world, and this drives the development of the second part of the psyche. So the ego development is when the individual learns what is possible and what's not possible. So this is where the child learns to have more interact with a more meaningful way with other people, with the environment, to try to satisfy, those cravings and those demands from the id. So Freud argued that the ego operates what he calls the reality principle, where the individual will be able to restrain their behavior until it's more appropriate or practical. The ego is also the part of your psyche that you're the most conscious of. You're generally aware of what you're doing and why. And finally, the last part of your psyche is superego. And this comes, according to Freud, from interaction with the caregiver, with guardian figure, and all those people who will either punish you for bad behavior or reward you for good behavior. So you kind take this superego as like an internal parent, or like an internal judge, or somebody who is in your head constantly rewarding you or punishing you for good and bad behavior. I kind of like this part. As Freud says, it comes from interaction with your parents. So when you do things that are bad in childhood and you get punished for them, that will develop into what we now call the conscious. So the fact is, you feel guilty for doing things as an adult if you were punished for them as a child. And the other side is called the ego ideal or pride. This is where you feel prideful about things you do as an adult that you were rewarded for doing as a child. So as you can see, Freud puts a very, very strong emphasis on interaction with parents, specifically with mother. Now you may ask, how's the interaction between these three parts of psyche? I'll describe them briefly. The ego is constantly in the middle of this push and pull from superego and id. The ego is always trying to best satisfy the id desires as well as superego desires to be morally good. And this is all about our psyche, their development and their interaction, according to Freud's idea. He also talked about the different stages of development, which the first one is the oral stage. So Freud observes that children between the ages of 0 to 1, they really enjoy stimulating their mouth. That's the primary source of pleasure from stimulating their mouth. And he speculated that children who seem to be overfed or frustrated will potentially have kind of fixation on this stage. And that can manifest as a personality disorder later in life. So he called them oral dependent and oral aggressive. So if a child is oral dependent, they develop this kind of oral dependent fixation. So as an adult, they're going to be more gullible and passive. But on the other side, the child, if they become more oral aggressive, they grow into, as they grow into adulthood, they will be more exploitative of others or more argumentative. So somebody who is always trying to manipulate you could say they have an oral aggressive personality. And these are all, idea and the whole idea behind this oral fixation. There is another term that I'm certain you've heard of before, and this is the anal stage of development. So this is between the ages of 1 to 3. Freud calls it anal stage because he noticed that children seem to get a lot of pleasure from learning to use the party. Or, they get a lot of pain or suffering from failure. To learn to use the party and learning how to use it or failing to do, it can result in a fixation at this stage. And that's why it's really important that parents don't use too harsh or too lenient a toiletry. So the anal retentive personality, which is the one I'm really sure you're familiar with, is when a person is stubborn, stingy, orderly, and could possibly clean. There is another kind of anal personality, and that's called anal explosive. As Freud puts it, sounds disgusting, and to be honest, this is disgusting. If you've ever met somebody with this kind of personality, these people are disorderly, messy, destructive, and cruel. The third stage is what Freud calls it phallic stage. So he says that children start to become more sexually aware. They start to recognize genders and they show a lot of interest and curiosity in matters of sex and gender. And this is between the ages of 3 to 6. And that's why I want to still keep saying that Freud wasn't a scientist, because these theories that I'm talking about, they're interesting and they have been very influential. People are still talking about this stuff today in male culture, but the stuff just doesn't have scientific support. So by talking about them, I'm not really trying to say we have any evidence to support any of these. In fact, in many cases, we have the opposite. We have evidence that shows the stuff just doesn't seem to work. But that being said, I just want to get the other way, because when it comes to the phallic stage, this is where certain transformation need to occur according to Freud. This is where boys will experience what he called the Oedipus conflict and girls will experience the Electra conflict. The Oedipus conflict is where, as Freud argues, the boy recognizes he's the same gender as the father, but he also recognizes the father's superior version of the gender. So he feels like a castration anxiety in order to resolve this anxiety and in order to resolve this inferiority. He has to shift his affection from the mother to the father. And as a result of this kind of shifting, he will be able to develop a conscience and become a heterosexual. On the other side is the girls' conflict, the Electra conflict. Now you're gonna hate this Electra conflict because with the Electra conflict, It's basically the same story, but gender swap with one big difference. So the girl recognizes she's the same gender as mother, feels conflicts, reverie for the father's affection, needs to shift her affection from the mother to the father. It's the same story as last time, but the one big difference here is that she's less able to accomplish this, based on what Freud says, because she can't overcome the castration anxiety. So in another word, women, according to Freud, are less capable of developing a conscious and becoming heterosexual because they don't have a penis. But the idea is completely rejected by modern experts. But that's what the electroconflict was according to non-scientific ideas of Freud. But regardless of Freud's ideas, this period of, in time is indeed a point where children do start to become more aware of sex issues. At the next stage, according to Freud, this personality development is called the latency stage. Freud basically said nothing interesting happened here at this stage. So it's since the 6 years old to become like a teenager. And then once they reach the teenage stage, that's what Freud called the genital stage, because that's for adult sexuality awaken. This is when they start to become interested in the opposite gender in a sexual way. Now I keep saying that Freud isn't a scientist and people have heavily criticized him. People even criticized him back then, but the whole idea here is, well, Freud was a very influential guy and we still talk about his theories today. A lot of these ideas, they just don't hold up under any kind of scientific investigations. So while they are interesting to talk about, there's really not much else to say.